One dangerous duke, one promised bride, and one look that changes everything. When the Duke of Renwick sees Vivienne Marshall across a crowded ballroom, obsession sparks instantly. But Vivienne belongs to another man, and falling for the wrong duke could ruin them both. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, do you love possessive dukes, slow burn tension, or forbidden romance most? And if you enjoy immersive Regency romance audiobooks, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a new escape into romance. Now settle in. Your escape into romance awaits. Happy listening. A Devil in Evening Clothes. Chapter 1. The Duke of Renwick walked into the Vance ballroom at 11 o'clock, and every conversation in the room shifted direction the way flowers turn toward light. Except that light was warm, and Callum Ashby was neither. Vivienne Marshall noticed him the way you notice a fire in a room you've just entered. Immediately, involuntarily, and with the specific instinct to identify the nearest exit. She had heard of him naturally. You could not move through a single London drawing room without hearing of the Duke of Renwick. He was 29, she'd been told, though he looked older, in the way of men who had done everything and found it wanting. He was the sort of handsome that wasn't comfortable to look at directly. Tall, dark, features too strong to be pretty and too precise to be ordinary, with the bearing of someone who had been told since birth that rooms arranged themselves around him and had found this to be, inconveniently, true. What the drawing rooms whispered, in lowered voices that became more vivid with every retelling, he had ruined a man financially at cards and felt no particular remorse. He had conducted 3 affairs simultaneously for 6 months, and when all 3 women discovered it, he had declined to apologise. He had told the Lord Chancellor to his face at a dinner party that his new policy was idiotic and had been correct, which was somehow worse than if he'd been wrong. What the drawing rooms also whispered, with an edge of something other than censure, that when Callum Ashby directed his full attention at you, you understood, briefly and ruinously, what it meant to be the only person in the world. Vivienne found this information useless and filed it accordingly. She was here because her mother had insisted, and her mother insisting was a force against which very little stood. She was standing at the edge of the room near the potted palms. Her customary position, not from shyness, but strategy. You saw everything from the edges. With a glass of champagne she wasn't drinking, and a composed expression she had been perfecting since she was 16. She was also, technically, promised to Sir Rowland Teft, who was 52, and standing near the fireplace with the proprietary patience of a man who had purchased something and was waiting for delivery. She didn't look at him. Looking at him made the champagne taste wrong. The Duke of Renwick moved through the room. People fell back. People surged forward. He deployed his attention like a man dealing cards. This much to Lady Pemberton, that much to Lord Vane, exactly enough to Lord Vane's daughter to make her flush without giving her cause for hope. He was magnificent at it. That was the honest assessment. Vivienne had watched powerful men work rooms before. Her father, his associates, the men who came to the house when they thought she was asleep. And most of them wanted something visible. Renwick looked like he wanted nothing. That was the trick. That was why it worked. Then something changed. He stopped. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone else would have caught. Just a fractional pause in his circuit of the room, like a clock that had skipped a beat. He was looking at someone. She tracked his eyeline out of pure analytical habit and she found that it was her. Not approaching, just looking from across the room with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not the practiced admiration he'd deployed on Lord Vane's daughter, not charm, not calculation, something more immediate than either. She looked back with the expression she kept for men who overestimated their effect on her. His jaw moved, fractionally, as though he was considering something and discarding it. He looked away first. Vivian took a sip of her champagne and said nothing, to no one, and felt something in her chest she absolutely refused to name. She did not see him again until 20 minutes later, when she stepped out onto the Vance terrace for air because the ballroom had grown oppressively warm, and found him already there. He was alone, leaning against the stone balustrade with a glass of brandy, looking at nothing in particular, and when he heard her step, he turned. They looked at each other. "Miss Marchal," he said. He knew her name. She hadn't expected that. "Your Grace." She did not retreat back through the doors, because retreating would have meant he'd affected her, and she had decided he hadn't. She moved to the other end of the balustrade. "I'll only be a moment. I needed air." "The room is appallingly warm." He returned his gaze to the garden. "Lady Vance always overheats her ballrooms. It's a power strategy. People make poor decisions when they're uncomfortable." "Do you make poor decisions, Your Grace?" "Frequently." He said it without any of the usual self-deprecating humor men use to make a virtue of their flaws. Just a statement. Though rarely about temperature. She looked at his profile. The lamplight from the ballroom windows put a hard edge on the line of his jaw, the set of his mouth. He looked, she thought, like a man carrying something heavy and long, accustomed to its weight. She did not want to find this interesting. "I understand you've been in Italy," she said, for something to say. 6 months. I find England tiresome in autumn." "Yet here you are in autumn." "My brother requires supervision." Something shifted in his expression, too fast to read, but there. "He has a talent for expensive disasters." "How brotherly of you." "It's purely selfish. His disasters become my problems." He glanced at her. "You're half French." "My mother is French. I am whole Vivian. Your ability to summarize a person in one fact is remarkable." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the precursor to one. "You've been in London 3 seasons and haven't yet married. Also remarkable given—" He stopped. "Given?" she prompted, very pleasantly. He looked at her directly. "Given that you're the most striking woman at this party." She blinked. She had been prepared for condescension, for the pointed curiosity men aimed at women with French blood and unconventional manners. She had not been prepared for that. Direct, unadorned, delivered as observation rather than flattery. "I have," she said carefully, "a complicated situation. The theft engagement. You know about that too. I know most things that are said in drawing rooms." He swirled his brandy. "You don't look at him." "I beg your pardon?" "Theft. He watched you cross the room 3 times tonight. You haven't looked at him once." His voice was dispassionate, analytical. "Either you dislike him intensely, or you have decided that indifference is the safest performance. I suspect the former." The audacity of it, the sheer breathtaking presumption, landed somewhere between her ribs and became a cold fury she kept firmly below the surface. "You," she said, with a sweetness that had nothing to do with sweet, "have spent exactly 4 minutes in my company, and you believe you have identified my emotional interior." 3 minutes, he said, "and I haven't identified it. I've made an observation. The difference matters. The difference between you being presumptuous and being accurate." She turned to face him fully. "You are the most arrogant man I have met in 3 seasons, Your Grace, and London has not been short of competition." He turned to face her too. They were 6 feet apart, and the night air was cold between them, and he was looking at her with an expression she now recognized. The focused, lit quality of a man who has been bored for a very long time and has just stopped being bored. "I know," he said, "and I notice you haven't told me I'm wrong." She wanted to. She opened her mouth to deliver the precise, dismantling sentence that would end this. He waited, unhurried, as though he had all night. The ballroom doors opened, and 3 people spilled out laughing, shattering the moment. Vivian turned back to the garden. A beat passed. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. "Miss Marshall." He said her name the way you mark a page in a book you intend to return to. She walked back into the ballroom and did not look back, and spent the rest of the evening aware, with a specificity she found infuriating, of exactly where he was in the room. He did not approach her again. That, somehow, was worse. Chapter 2. Bertram Crail was, Callum had long acknowledged, a man of limited wisdom and considerable entertainment value. He was also, which was the relevant quality, a man of limitless observation. He had watched the terrace scene from the ballroom window. Callum had known this. Bertram always watched, and had collected the fact of it the way a crow collected shiny things. "The Marshall woman," he said, the following afternoon at their club, over cards that neither of them was concentrating on. "No." "You spoke to her for—" "No, Bertram. She's extraordinary looking. That bone structure. Her mother was a comtesse, you know, the real article, not one of the self-appointed ones. And she's sharp enough to cut you open and count your rings." Bertram arranged his cards. "I've watched 3 men attempt her this season. All 3 came away visibly smaller." Callum said nothing. He was thinking about the way she'd turned to face him on the terrace. Fully, squarely, without the sideways defensive angle most women adopted when they felt threatened. She had faced him head-on, like something that hadn't learned to be afraid of him yet. "She's also," Bertram continued, in the voice of a man setting a trap, "apparently entirely immune to you." Callum looked up. "Word travels," Bertram said pleasantly. "Lady Vance's companion saw the terrace. The story going round is that you tried your charm and got your head handed to you." "I did not." "Which is why," Bertram said, "I'll give you until the Pempford house party. 3 weeks. If you can make Vivian Marshall look at you, genuinely look, the way she looked at Fenworth's painting of the Loire last month when she didn't know anyone was watching, I owe you £50. Callum set down his cards. "Not a smile," Bertram continued. "Not a courtesy laugh. I want the look she keeps for things she actually wants. You know the one. Everyone has it?" He paused. "You're the only man alive who might manage it. I'd like to see what it costs you." The last sentence was different from the rest. Not the usual sports betting lightness. Something more considered. Callum picked up his brandy. He thought about the terrace, about the sentence she'd cut off before she could finish it. She'd caught herself. He'd watched her catch herself. About the fact that she hadn't denied his observation about theft. £50 is insulting," he said. "Name your sum." "I don't want your money." He drank. "I want—" He stopped, because what he actually wanted was to go back to the terrace and finish the conversation she'd walked away from, and that was not something he was going to say to Bertram Crail. "Done," Bertram said, as though Callum had agreed to something. "Pempford house party, 3 weeks. Callum looked at him. "I said nothing." "You didn't say no." Bertram collected the cards. You also haven't told me I'm wrong about the look." He hadn't. He put down his glass and stood and left without answering, which was answer enough, and they both knew it. In the carriage home, he sat in the dark and examined himself with the cold honesty he brought to all unpleasant tasks. He was intrigued. That was fine. He was frequently intrigued. It was his primary method of staying interested in a world that had exhausted most of its novelty. What was less fine, what required the cold honesty, was the quality of this particular intrigue. It wasn't the puzzle of her. It wasn't even the novelty of a woman who didn't bend toward him. It was the terrace. It was 6 feet of night air, and a woman looking at him like she was deciding something, and the specific sensation, which he had not felt in years, possibly ever, of being looked at instead of admired. Admiration was comfortable. It required nothing from the recipient. Being looked at was a different transaction entirely. He reached his townhouse and went directly to his study and picked up a letter he'd been ignoring from his brother Gideon, who was currently at Cambridge, spending money that did not exist on activities that did not bear investigation. He dealt with it. He dealt with 2 estate letters after that. He was efficient and decisive, and entirely in command of himself. He went to bed at 1 in the morning and lay in the dark and thought about nothing in particular. Vivienne Marchal's face in the lamplight was, specifically, nothing in particular. He accepted the house party invitation the following morning. Chapter 3. Pemford Hall was the kind of country house that had been built to impress and had succeeded so thoroughly that it had forgotten how to be comfortable. Everything was large. The ceilings, the fireplaces, the windows, the silences between people who had exhausted each other's company by the second afternoon. Vivienne arrived on Friday and was shown to her room and stood at the window looking at the grounds and felt the particular compressed pressure of knowing that Sir Rowland Teft was also in the house. She had seen his carriage at the gate, and that the next fortnight required her to perform a contentment she did not feel, in company that would be watching for cracks. She was good at performance. She had been performing since she was 12 years old, when she first understood that being the daughter of a half-disgraced English lord and a French comtesse of volatile temperament meant that every room she entered had an opinion about her before she spoke. She had learned to give them nothing, straight spine, controlled mouth, eyes that missed nothing and revealed nothing. The Duke of Renwick arrived on Saturday afternoon. She knew the moment he arrived because the quality of the drawing-room changed, not loudly, not with the kind of stir a lesser man might produce, but in the way of a room when its pressure shifts. 3 conversations redirected. Lady Pemford's posture improved, and Vivienne, who was in the window seat with a book she was actually reading, felt the particular prickling awareness at the back of her neck that she associated with being watched. She turned a page. She did not look up. "Miss Marshall?" She looked up. He was standing at the entrance to the window alcove, which was narrow enough that his presence in it constituted a kind of occupation. He had the travel dust of the road still on him, hadn't changed yet, and he was looking at her with the same expression as the terrace, the assessing one, the one that didn't pretend to be anything else. "You're in my seat," he said. She looked at the window seat. She looked at him. "I was here first. I sit here every time I come to Pemford. Lady Pemford will confirm it." "Lady Pemford is not here, and neither is your name on the cushion." She returned to her book. "Find another seat." A pause. Then he moved into the alcove. There was barely room, and sat at the other end of the window seat, folding himself into it with a deliberate ease that suggested he was exactly where he intended to be. She stared at her page. "What are you reading?" he asked. Something you wouldn't find interesting. Try me. She showed him the spine, Chaumet's treatise on French property law. He looked at it. You're reading property law at a house party. I'm reading property law because it's relevant to my situation. The house party is incidental. Your situation being the theft engagement. My situation, she said, with the precision of someone placing a full stop, is my own. Theft is 52. Your arithmetic is impressive. He's also been married before. 2 wives, both of whom developed mysterious ailments within a year of the wedding and spent the remainder of the marriage in the country. She went very still. What are you implying? Nothing sinister. Both women are alive and apparently thriving in Devonshire and Bath, respectively. He held her gaze. But the pattern of a man who selects young wives and then relocates them is worth noting, I'd think, for a woman studying property law. She studied him, the bold, dark eyes, the composed, infuriating certainty of him. Why? She said slowly. Are you telling me this? Because you're clearly not marrying him by choice, he said, and I find it difficult to watch intelligent people walk into traps they haven't fully mapped. I have fully... She stopped. Have you? She held the book against her chest and looked at him and felt the fury of it, the specific fury of a man who, in 3 minutes, had located the exact thing she did not want located. You are, she said, without question, the most invasive person I have ever encountered. You keep saying versions of that. You haven't said inaccurate. Your Grace. She stood up, which required him to stand also, which he did, which put them at a distance of less than 2 feet in a narrow alcove. She refused to step back. Whatever game you're playing, no game. Whatever it is you think you're doing, I assure you it will not work. What do you think I'm doing? I don't know yet. Her voice was level, her pulse was not. But men like you don't seek out women like me without a reason, and the reasons are never flattering. Something moved in his face, something she didn't expect. Not offense, not the usual male injury of being doubted, something more considered. Men like me, he repeated. Powerful, accustomed to getting whatever they want. Bored. She tilted her chin up by a fraction. I'm not a diversion, Your Grace. Find your entertainment elsewhere. She stepped past him and out of the alcove and walked the length of the drawing room with her property law treatise under her arm and her spine absolutely straight, and she did not once look back. Behind her, Callum stood in the window alcove and watched her go and felt something he hadn't felt since his 20s. The sharp, clean shock of wanting something he absolutely could not have, and knowing the wanting was already too far gone to be put back. Bertram materialized at his shoulder from nowhere. I see you've reintroduced yourselves. Go away, Bertram. You look, Bertram said thoughtfully, like a man who's lost 20 pounds already. He was not wrong. Chapter 4. The house party had its rhythms, and within 2 days, those rhythms had arranged themselves around the specific gravitational pull of 2 people who could not be in the same room without the temperature dropping 10 degrees. Or rising 10 degrees. The guests were not entirely sure which. What they were sure of, what they discussed in the corridors and over their morning chocolate with the avidity of people who had been given a far better entertainment than Lady Pempford had planned, was that the Duke of Renwick and Miss Marchall had an extraordinary talent for being in each other's vicinity. They're not flirting, observed Mrs. Caldwell to Lady Pempford on the 3rd day. No, agreed Lady Pempford. They're not exactly arguing either. No? Then what in heaven's name are they doing? Lady Pempford considered the scene before her. Vivienne at the far end of the breakfast table, demolishing a piece of toast with focused energy, and the Duke at the other end, reading the newspaper with the attentiveness of a man who has not heard a word of it for 10 minutes. Something more interesting than either, she said. What the guests couldn't see, because it happened in places rooms didn't reach, was the fighting. Day 2. The library. Vivienne arrived to return her property law book and found Callum already there, at the desk, writing what appeared to be estate correspondence with the concentrated efficiency of a man who brought his work everywhere. She put her book away. She selected another. She turned to leave. Runnymede versus Archford, 1804, he said, without looking up. If Teft has a similar entailment structure in his property deeds, the second wife situation makes more sense. She likely had no legal recourse. Vivienne stopped. She turned around. Why, she said very quietly, do you keep doing this? I mentioned that I find it difficult to watch. I know what you said. She set her book down on the nearest surface with more force than she intended. I am asking why it concerns you. You don't know me. You have no stake in my situation. You are a man with a reputation for causing women problems, not solving them. So why? He set down his pen. He turned in his chair and looked at her with the full attention that was, she was discovering, his most dangerous quality, not the charm. He'd barely bothered with charm around her, which she noted. The attention. Because, he said, you are the only person in this house who speaks to me like a human being rather than a title, and I would like you to still be speaking to me in a year, which requires you not to be in Devonshire. The silence was extraordinary. That, she said after a moment, is either the most honest thing you've said to me, or a very sophisticated manipulation. Why can't it be both? She stared at him. Because, she pressed her lips together, because an honest manipulation is still a manipulation. An honest manipulation is also a courtesy. He picked up his pen again. I could lie to you, Miss Marchal. I find I don't want to. You find it inconvenient, you mean? Lying to me requires tracking the lie, and I would catch it, and then you'd have lost the... She stopped. The? He prompted. The whatever it is you think you're building here, she said. Good day, Your Grace. She left the book on the table and walked out and stood in the corridor with her hand flat against the wall and her jaw tight, breathing. She was angry. Good. Anger was a landscape she knew. Anger had edges and weight and direction. Anger was not the alternative, which was the sensation she'd had for approximately 30 seconds when he'd said the words, still be speaking to me, which had felt like something reaching through her chest wall and rearranging things without permission. She pushed off the wall and walked to the morning room, where the other women were engaged in needlework she would rather eat the needle than participate in, and sat down, and picked up her own embroidery frame and stabbed at it with considerable focus. Day 3. The gallery. The long gallery at Pemford was lined with portraits of ancestors who had long since stopped being accountable for anything, and Vivienne walked its length in the afternoons for the specific pleasure of being alone. Everyone else found it cold and draughty, and the ancestral Pemfords uniformly grim. She liked the grimness. There was honesty in it. On the third afternoon, she turned the corner at the far end and found Callum looking at a portrait of the fourth Lady Pemford, a woman with an extraordinary jaw and an expression like she'd seen through everyone around her and found them wanting. She looks like you, he said. Vivienne looked at the portrait. She looks formidable. Yes. She stood beside him and looked at the fourth Lady Pemford, who gazed back at them both with magnificent indifference. She outlived 3 husbands, Vivian said. Lady Pemford told me. Each one left her better off than the last. She managed the estate herself for 40 years between the second and third marriages. A pause. I found that more interesting than any of the male portraits. I imagine you did. He was looking at the portrait still. She would have eaten most of the men in this house alive. All of them. Including me? Vivian glanced at him sideways. Especially you. His mouth curved, not the polished social smile. Something involuntary, a little reluctant. Probably fair, he said. She looked at that expression before she could stop herself. The unguarded version of him. The one that appeared in flashes and disappeared before she could study it properly. In the grey light of the gallery, he looked less like a danger and more like a man. She did not want him to look like a man. Men she could dismiss. Men were comprehensible. What she could not afford was the other thing. The version of him she saw in the library and the window alcove. The one that said things like, I find I don't want to lie to you, with the flat honesty of someone making an accounting. Why did you come to this house party? She said. My brother is not here, she said. I've seen no young Mr. Ashby. You came alone? She watched his face. Why? He held her gaze for a moment with the expression of a man deciding how much of himself to spend. Because you were going to be here. The words dropped into the gallery silence, and Vivian felt them go through her. Cold, then warm, then cold again, in rapid succession. That's... She exhaled. You cannot say things like that. I find I keep saying them anyway. It's inappropriate. I am an engaged woman. You are a woman being arranged, he said, sharp enough to cut. There's a difference. Don't. Her voice came out harder than she intended. Don't tell me what I am. Don't analyze my situation with that surgical certainty of yours, as if I haven't been living it. You see me across 3 conversations, and you think you understand what I've had to calculate, what it costs. You don't. Her voice had gone to a low intensity she hadn't planned. You've never had to calculate anything in your life. You were born a duke. You've never had to choose between what you want and what keeps your family alive. The silence afterward was different from the ones before. He didn't come back at her. She'd expected the parry. He was quick, and she knew it. Instead, he was quiet, looking at her with an expression that was not the assessing one, not the amused one, not the one she'd been cataloguing and guarding against. Something more stripped than any of those. No, he said. You're right. I haven't. She hadn't expected the concession. It disarmed her in a way the arguing hadn't. I have had, he said carefully, to choose between what I feel and what I allow myself to feel, which is not the same thing, but it is something. She looked at him, at the gallery windows, grey with late afternoon light, at the fourth Lady Pemford, who had outlived 3 husbands and managed 40 years alone. I need to go and change for dinner, she said. Miss Marshall. He stopped her with her name, not her arm. She paused. For what it's worth, and I am aware it may be worth very little, I meant what I said in the library. I don't want to lie to you. That is a novel experience for me, and I'm handling it poorly. She stood with her back to him for a beat longer than she should have. You should practice, she said, the handling. And she walked the length of the gallery without looking back, which was becoming a habit around him, and one she was finding increasingly unconvincing. Chapter 5. Vivian lay in the dark of her Pempford guest room at 1 a.m. and conducted an inventory. She was a practical woman. She had always been practical. When she was 17 and her father's situation had first become clear, the debts, the entailment problems, the slow narrowing of options, she had responded not with tears, but with information. She had read every legal document she could access. She had learned French property law from her mother's family and English property law from her father's solicitors, and she had arrived, at 23, at a position most people would have called resigned, but that she called accurate. She knew exactly what she had to work with. What she had to work with was a father who loved her and was dying of something the physicians couldn't name, a mother who was magnificent and entirely impractical, a family name that was half compromised by her father's bad investments and half elevated by her mother's bloodline, a face and mind that attracted attention she mostly didn't want, and an engagement to Sir Rowland Teft that would solve the immediate financial crisis and relocate her to Devonshire and leave her, if Callum Ashby's observation was accurate, with the same approximate freedom as the second Lady Teft. She stared at the ceiling. The inventory of what she had to work with did not include the Duke of Renwick. The Duke of Renwick was not a factor. He was a complication, and complications were not the same as factors, and she had spent 3 seasons effectively managing complications. She closed her eyes. His voice in the gallery. "I meant what I said in the library." She opened her eyes. The problem was not that she disliked him. The problem was the opposite. The specific, inconvenient, genuinely alarming discovery that she liked him with a precision she hadn't managed with most people. Not the performance of him, not the reputation. The version that appeared in libraries and galleries, saying things with the flat honesty of someone who didn't know how else to say them. She liked the arguing. That was the worst part. Most men retreated or sharpened into cruelty when she pushed back. He pushed back. He matched her point for point, with a brain that moved at the same speed as hers, and she had been. She was willing to admit to herself in the dark, where it didn't count, exhilarated. She could not be exhilarated. She had 58 days until the formal Teft engagement announcement, and a father who'd had another bad week, and a mother who didn't know the full extent of it. She turned over and pressed her face into the pillow. She was going to be very sensible about this. She was going to treat Callum Ashby as she treated every other man at this house party, with polite, impenetrable indifference. And she was going to stop thinking about the way his composure cracked at the edges, specifically around her, in ways that looked involuntary and felt like being handed something she had stopped expecting to receive. She pressed harder into the pillow. Tomorrow. She would be sensible tomorrow. She was not sensible the next morning. The next morning was the riding party, and she rode well, better than most of the women and several of the men. And Callum rode beside her for the first mile without speaking, which she found more disruptive than speaking would have been. "You're doing it again," she finally said. "What?" "Riding beside me in silence, as though you've won something." "I haven't won anything." He kept his eyes on the path. "I'm riding beside you because you set a pace none of the others can match, and you clearly don't want to slow down." She looked at the others, who had fallen back in a cheerful, loose cluster. "I never slow down." "I know." He glanced at her sideways, just briefly. "It's one of the things I find—" He stopped. "Find what?" He said nothing, which meant he'd caught himself, she realized. Had been about to say something he'd decided not to say, and the stopping of it was almost more revealing than the something would have been. One of the things you find, she prompted. Difficult, he said, to look away from. The path curved through a stand of birch trees, and the others were well behind them, and she was very aware of the cold air and the sound of 2 horses, and the way he'd said difficult with the quality of an admission made under protest. She kept her eyes forward. "Your Grace," she said. "Callum," he said. "No. You're going to keep calling me Your Grace when we're alone in the middle of a field." "We're not alone. There are 11 people 50 yards behind us." "Close enough." He angled slightly toward her, just slightly, just enough that she could see his expression without turning. It was the one from the gallery, the stripped one. "Call me Callum." "I don't know you well enough." "You've argued with me in 3 different rooms and know my opinion on property law, French blood, and the 4th Lady Pemford." He paused. "You know me better than people I've spent years in company with." She looked ahead at the path. Her horse shook its head, impatient. "Callum," she said, like a test. The word in her mouth had a different weight than she'd expected. "Are you going to tell me what you want from me? Plainly, without the—" She gestured, which encompassed everything. The window alcove, the gallery, the riding beside her in pointed silence. "No." She looked at him sharply. "Because I haven't decided yet," he said, with an honesty so blunt it nearly knocked her from the saddle. "I know what I want in the immediate sense. I know what would make that impossible. I haven't yet determined whether wanting something impossible is worth—" He stopped. "I'm in the middle of working it out." "And I'm what? The equation you're solving?" "No." His voice changed quality. "You're the variable that makes the equation harder." They rode in silence for a moment that lasted longer than it should. "Harder how?" she said, and then hated that she'd asked. He didn't answer immediately. They crested the low hill, and Pemford appeared below them in the winter morning, smoke rising from its chimneys, the other riders' voices carrying faintly on the cold air. "Harder?" he said finally. "As in, I spent the last 8 years ensuring I didn't need anyone enough to be made a fool of by it. And then you sat in my window seat and told me I was invasive, and I have not been entirely comfortable since." She stared at the house below. 8 years, she said. "Since my mother died," he said. Quiet. A door opened briefly and closed. "She loved my father the way you love something you've built your whole life around. When he died, she had nothing left to organize herself around. She lasted 11 months. Vivian said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. "So," he said, back to his usual register, "I am not, by design, a man who allows variables. And yet," he said. The other riders caught up. The conversation closed the way conversations close when company arrives, completely, sealed over, as though it hadn't happened. But it had happened. And Vivian rode back to Pemford Hall, knowing that the inventory she'd conducted last night was missing an item, and that adding it changed the totals in ways she wasn't yet ready to calculate. Chapter 6. On the 5th day, Lady Opaline Vance arrived. Vivian knew who she was immediately, not from personal acquaintance, but from the particular shift in Callum's posture when she walked into the drawing room. Not warmth, not coldness. The specific, careful neutrality of a man managing a history. She had been his mistress. Everyone knew this. It had been 18 months ago, a 6-month arrangement that had ended with Lady Opaline leaving for the continent and returning with a new title courtesy of a brief Italian marriage, and a collection of extremely knowing glances that she deployed on Callum with the precision of someone who understood exactly what effect they produced. Opaline was spectacular. Vivienne acknowledged this with the same flat honesty she brought to everything. Pale gold hair, a figure that made evening dress look invented for her, and the specific charisma of a woman who had decided she would not be made uncomfortable by any room she entered. She embraced Lady Pemford. She kissed both of Bertram Crail's cheeks. She settled into the house party with the ease of water finding its level. And then she looked at Callum across the drawing room, and the look was warm and specific and entirely private. And Vivienne felt something sink its teeth into her ribs. Not jealousy. She refused to call it jealousy. Jealousy required a claim, and she had no claim. And she had been very clear with herself in the dark of last night that she was not going to develop one. She would call it instead information. She was gathering information. The information was, this woman had known him. This woman still looked at him with the familiarity of someone who had seen what was underneath the composure and had found her way back into the same room. The information felt like a splinter. Callum crossed to Opaline. They spoke. She laughed. It was a knowing laugh, the kind that referenced things not in the room. He smiled with the control of a man who knows he's being watched and has chosen not to react in either direction. He looked up. He found Vivienne across the room immediately, as though he'd known where she was. She looked away first. That was the information she should have had before she looked at him at all. She moved to the far end of the room near the windows, where Mrs. Caldwell was discussing the new garden designs, and she listened and contributed and kept her eyes away from the centre of the room with the effort of someone doing something that should not require effort. Later, the evening after dinner. The drawing room had divided itself in the natural way of house parties. Card tables, a cluster at the pianoforte where Miss Aldworth was playing, a smaller group near the fire. Vivienne was in the fire group with a cup of tea she didn't want, partly because the fire was warm and partly because Opaline was at the pianoforte group and the fire was on the opposite side of the room. Callum appeared beside her, not by accident. She had stopped believing anything he did was by accident. He settled beside her with a cup of brandy and looked at the fire and said, quietly enough that only she heard, "You're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you're very still, and your face is entirely composed, and you're furious." "I am not." "You've been doing it since Opaline arrived." His voice was very low and very level. "I want you to know that she is—" "Please," she said, with a precision that could cut glass. "Do not tell me who she is to you. I don't require the information." "She's someone I was careless with," he said, as though she hadn't spoken. "She deserved better, and she knows it, and so do I. It's not unresolved." He paused. "In case you were wondering." I was not wondering. "Your stillness suggests otherwise." She turned to look at him sharply and found him looking at the fire with the composed profile and an expression she now recognized as the deliberate withholding one, the face he wore when he had more than he was saying. "You are," she said, barely above a whisper. "Insufferable." "Generally, yes." He didn't look at her. "You were watching her look at me." "I was observing the room." "You were watching her look at me," he said again, with the patient certainty of a man who was right and knew it. "And your jaw did that thing it does." "What thing?" "The thing where it tightens a fraction on the right side when something lands in a way you don't want it to land." He was still looking at the fire. "I notice it. I notice—" He stopped. His jaw moved. I notice things about you that I did not design to notice. The fire crackled. Someone at the pianoforte began a Haydn sonata. Callum? She used his name without meaning to, and felt him feel it, saw the slight change in his posture. You need to stop. Probably. We can't. There is nowhere for this to go. You know that. I know the obstacles. He finally looked at her, briefly, controlled, but she caught the full weight of it before he looked away. I know them better than you think. Then, I know the obstacles, he said again, quieter. I haven't said they were insurmountable. She stood with the untouched tea and the fire warmth and 58 days and said nothing, because anything she said would be either a lie or a door, and she wasn't ready to open the door. Across the room, Opaline played a card and laughed at something Bertram said, and Vivian stood very still beside Callum and felt the splinter in her ribs and refused with everything she had, to call it what it was. Chapter 7. The 7th day brought rain, and the 7th evening brought a game. Lady Pemford, with the enterprise of a hostess who understood that cooped-up guests needed occupation, or they'd invent their own amusements at worse cost, organised a parlour game. Charades, specifically. Teams. Vivian was assigned to a team with Bertram Crail, Mrs. Caldwell, a pleasant young man named Aldworth, and, by what she suspected was not coincidence, Callum. They were winning. This was primarily because Callum and Vivian had, without consulting each other or planning it, developed an alarming ability to read the other's performance of a word in approximately 6 seconds, which their teammates found impressive and Vivian found deeply inconvenient, because the quality of understanding you developed with someone who matched your way of thinking was not something you could keep out of your face. The problem arrived in the 3rd round, when Vivian performed her word, navigation, and Callum, who was guessing, stood up without breaking eye contact with her and said, navigation, in the tone of a man who had been watching her hands and her face and her absolutely everything, and translated it all without the word even completing itself in the air. The team cheered. Bertram looked between them with an expression that Vivian liked considerably less than his usual expression. In the pause between rounds, the guests refreshed their drinks and rearranged. Callum materialized beside Vivian at the drinks table and said, very quietly, "You're enjoying this." "I'm enduring it." "You're enjoying it. You made the 3rd gesture more complicated on purpose to see if I'd catch it." She had done exactly that. She kept her face neutral. "I was performing the word accurately." "You performed navigation with a maritime joke that you invented on the spot because you knew I'd get it." He handed her a glass of wine. She hadn't asked for it. He'd known she was about to. "You wanted to see if I'd keep up. And did you find the answer informative?" "I found it." He stopped. He was very close. The drinks table was against the wall, and the other guests were behind them, and there was not quite enough room. And she was aware of him in the way that had become her baseline state in this house, constant, specific, impossible to manage out of existence. "I find most things about you informative," he said. She looked at the wine. "We're very good at this game." "Yes." "That's a problem." "Why?" She looked up at him. "Because it means we think in the same way, and that's—" She stopped. "Dangerous?" he said. "Inconvenient," she said firmly. He looked at her with the eyes that had this quality she hated, this quality of seeing her, not the surface version, not the composed face she gave the world, but the underneath version that had opinions about everything and loved an argument and had been desperately lonely in an extremely dignified way for most of her adult life. "Vivian," he said. Her first name, which she had not given him permission to use, and which sounded in his mouth like something claimed. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say something that would make tonight very complicated." He was quiet for a moment. The game was reforming behind them. "I was going to say," he said slowly, "that you ought to see the Pempford garden after dark. There's a particular section that's there's a view." She looked at him. "A view," she said, "of the grounds. At night. It's remarkably clear tonight, given the rain earlier." She studied him for a long moment. He held the look with the composure of someone who has proposed something perfectly innocent and is not going to dignify the alternative reading with acknowledgement. "This is a terrible idea," she said. "Probably," he agreed. The garden was cold and very dark, except for the moon, which had emerged from the rain clouds with inconvenient brightness. Vivian pulled her shawl tighter and followed him down the stone steps from the terrace and along the path that wound between the formal hedges. There was, she had to acknowledge, a view. The grounds opened at the far end into a sweep of lawn that caught the moonlight, and beyond that, the home wood was black and significant, and the house behind them was lit at every window, distant and warm, like something from another world. They stood at the low stone wall at the garden's edge, close but not touching. The cold air between them was the loudest thing. "What do you want?" she said, quietly. Not the question she'd asked on horseback. Not what he wanted from her. What he wanted. Period. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Things I've been very sensible about not wanting for 8 years," he said. She looked at the moonlit lawn. Her pulse was doing something she hadn't authorized. "And now you're being less sensible." "Against my better judgment, yes." "Why now? Why me?" "Because you're the first person in 8 years who has been genuinely unimpressed by me." He said it with no self-pity, just observation. "You're unimpressed by my title, my reputation, my face, my ability to make rooms arrange themselves around me. All the things I've used as armor." He paused. "It's quite difficult to use armor against someone who doesn't want your gold." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the lawn. In the moonlight, he looked different from the drawing room version, less defended, more real. The strong features and the jaw and the eyes that were dark in this light, almost black. "I'm not unimpressed," she said, before she could stop herself. He turned. "I am—" She gathered herself. "I am very deliberately not allowing myself to be impressed. That is not the same thing." He looked at her. The moonlit garden was very quiet. "Why are you telling me that?" he said, low. "Because you said you find it difficult to look away from me, and it's only fair that you know it is." She exhaled. "It is not a one-directional problem." The silence stretched. He raised his hand, and she felt it before it arrived. Felt the intent of it, the specificity of a man who has decided to do something after considerable argument with himself. His fingers went to her jaw, not gripping. Just the warmth of his palm at the side of her face, his thumb at the line of her cheekbone. She should have stepped back. She had 58 days, and a father who was ill, and a signed preliminary agreement with Sir Rowland Teft. She had 15 excellent reasons to step back. She didn't step back. He watched her not step back. He leaned forward. The terrace doors opened. Laughter. Footsteps. Two of the guests coming out for air, voices carrying in the cold night. He withdrew his hand. They both turned toward the house. She breathed. The guests spotted them, waved, said something cheerful about the moon. Vivian called back something appropriate. Beside her, Callum stood with the composed, unhurried look that gave nothing away, but she felt his exhale. One single, controlled breath, the sound of a man reassembling himself. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone of the wall. Her jaw, right where his hand had been. She could still feel it. The guests turned back toward the house, and Callum said very quietly, "Tomorrow." And it wasn't a question. She said nothing, but she also didn't say no. Chapter 8. Tomorrow came, and she avoided him. Not clumsily. She was not a clumsy woman. She sat at the far end of breakfast, accepted an invitation to walk with Mrs. Caldwell and Miss Aldworth, and spent the morning occupying herself with such visible contentment that no one could have guessed she was managing the space between herself and a specific man with the precision of a cartographer. Callum said nothing. He was at the other end of every room she entered. He did not seek her out. He was, she noted, with the part of her brain she couldn't seem to switch off, doing the same thing she was doing, managing the distance, which meant he was as aware of it as she was, which meant... She redirected herself to Mrs. Caldwell's commentary on the garden. In the afternoon, he played billiards with Bertram and two others. She watched, involuntarily, from the corridor window that overlooked the billiards room. She watched for 30 seconds. The easy way he moved around the table, the particular quality of his laugh when Bertram did something foolish. And then she walked on with great purpose and told herself she'd been looking at the garden. In the evening, he sat across the room at dinner. He talked to Opaline on his left and Lord Pempford on his right, and he was charming and composed, and she could not hear what he was saying, and it was driving her quietly insane. 3 times across the table, without appearing to, she glanced at him. 3 times she found him already looking at her, not performing it, not making a display, just looking, with the dark eyes and the particular quality of attention she had started to feel like a physical thing, a warmth that crossed the distance between the place settings and landed somewhere under her sternum and stayed there. She ate approximately half of a very good dinner and tasted none of it. That night in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and had an extremely honest conversation with herself. She was in trouble. That was the honest conversation in its entirety. She had been careful and strategic, and she had built her walls at the exact right height for 3 London seasons, and one previously unknown duke had arrived and identified every structural weakness from the outside, and she was in considerable, specific, growing trouble. The worst part was not that she wanted him. The worst part was that she recognized him. That specific, devastating quality of recognizing someone who thinks the way you do and means what they say and has never bothered being comfortable just to make you comfortable. She'd never encountered it before. She hadn't known to guard against it because she hadn't known it existed. She pressed her face into her hands. 57 days. She was going to go to sleep and wake up and be sensible. She had always been sensible. It was her primary quality. She was going to deploy it now. She was not sensible the next day either. The next day, the incident in the corridor. She was coming from the library. He was coming from, she didn't know, and later didn't care. The corridor at the east wing was narrow, and they arrived at the turning simultaneously, and the choice to stop was physical rather than social. There was simply not room to pass without one of them yielding. He did not yield. She did not yield. They stood 2 feet apart in the east corridor at 11 in the morning, with the rain coming down outside the window at the end of the passage, and looked at each other. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Neither of them moved. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "I've been occupied. You've been managing the distance between us with the efficiency of someone who knows that if they stop managing it, something will happen." He watched her. "I've been doing the same thing, for the record. I'm not winning." She pressed her lips together. "I don't know what you want me to say to that." "I don't want you to say anything." He glanced down the corridor. Empty, both directions. "I want you to stop looking at me across rooms like you've decided something and haven't told me what." "I haven't decided anything." "You've decided to be afraid of me." "I'm not afraid of you." She was specifically afraid of herself, which was different and worse. But this was not information she was giving him. "I'm being practical." "About?" "About the fact that this—" She gestured at the narrow corridor, at him, at the whole situation. "Leads nowhere. About the fact that there is a man in this house to whom I have obligations. Obligations you despise. They are still obligations." Her voice cracked slightly on the word. Not visibly. She didn't think visibly, but he caught it. She saw him catch it. "Vivienne." He said her name the way he'd said it in the garden, like a claim. "Don't." "I'm going to fix it." He said it quietly, with the flat certainty he brought to decisions. "The Teft situation. I have contacts. Teft's financial structure has vulnerabilities that—" "No." She cut him off, sharp as a blade. "No, you don't get to. This is not your problem to solve. I am not a problem for you to solve. I am a person making choices in circumstances you don't fully understand, and charging in with your title and your connections to rearrange things is—" She pressed the bridge of her nose. "It's exactly the kind of thing that would be done with the best intentions and make everything worse." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him absorb the refusal. Not angrily, but with the tight-jawed quality of a man who has to revise something. "All right," he said. She blinked. "All right?" "I won't. Not without your knowledge and consent." He met her eyes. "But I want you to know that I'm looking for a way, if you'll let me." She stared at him. The rain came down the window. "Why?" she said, and it came out smaller than she intended. He looked at her for a long moment and said nothing, but the thing in his face, the open, unguarded, unnerving thing, said everything. She stepped past him. Not because she wanted to, but because standing still in that corridor was the most dangerous thing she could do. "Tomorrow," he said again, to her back. She walked away. Her hands were not entirely steady, which was new and unwelcome information about herself. Chapter 9. The kiss happened in the library. Of course it did. The library was where everything happened between them, as if the books were witnesses they'd accidentally appointed. It was 11 days into the house party. Vivienne had stopped counting how many times she'd managed the distance. She'd also stopped entirely convincing herself that the managing was working. She had come for the French law volume. He was already there, at the desk, and this time he didn't pretend to be doing something else. He put down his pen when she walked in and looked at her directly. "Lock the door," he said. Her hand stopped on the doorframe. "Absolutely not." "So that we can have a conversation without it stopping every time someone walks past." She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she turned and shot the library bolt. It was a small bolt, ineffective against determined entry, but it would create warning. She crossed to the shelves, found the volume, turned around. He had not moved from the desk, but he was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, more open than usual, less controlled. "Bertram is going to tell you about the bet," he said. She stared. "What bet?" "He offered me £50 to make you look at me. Genuinely, not politely." He held her gaze. Not a smile, a real look, the kind you keep for things that matter. She felt the air go out of the room. "He told me the night of the Vance ball," Callum continued. "I didn't disagree. I didn't agree either, technically. But I didn't disagree. And I came to Pemford knowing you'd be here. That is the truth of how this started, and you should know it." The silence was very loud. "Why?" she said. "Are you telling me this?" "Because Bertram has the look of a man who is about to be entertainingly stupid, and if you hear it from him first, you'll assume the worst." He paused. "You'd be partially right to." She looked at the book in her hands, the French law volume she no longer cared about. So, the conversations, the gallery, the corridor, the garden, were not the bet, he said, with the force of something he needed her to believe. "I want to be completely clear about this. The bet was Bertram's amusement. What has happened between us is—" His jaw tightened. "Significantly outside anything I planned. But it started with a bet. The arrival started with a bet." He stood up. "You are nothing like what I came here expecting, and I have been in continuous difficulty since the terrace at the Vance ball, and none of that was what Bertram intended when he offered me £50. She looked at him. Across the library, across the desk, in the morning light. "I don't know whether to believe you," she said. "I know." He came around the desk, slowly, not rushing. "I know I've given you incomplete information up to this point, and I am aware that trust requires more than a confession delivered preemptively." He stopped a few feet from her. "But I would rather have this conversation badly than not have it." She looked at him for a long time. "The look he wanted," she said. "What does it look like?" He described it as the way you looked at a painting in the Fenworth Gallery last month, like something you actually wanted. Something moved in her face. "He was watching me. Bertram watches everyone." He paused. "I have also been watching you. I don't apologize for it because I can't. You are—" He stopped. For the first time, she saw the thing that was usually held back simply be absent, not retrieved. "You are the most entirely yourself person I have met in a very long time, and it is a considerable problem for a man who decided to stop wanting things that could undo him." She looked at him. Her jaw was not tight. She'd lost control of that around the 7th sentence. The French law volume was still in her hands, and she was gripping it tighter than she needed to. "You might have simply not come to Pemford," she said. "Yes." "And then none of this would be—" "Yes." "Do you regret it?" He answered without hesitating. "No." She set the book on the nearest table. He crossed the remaining distance. Not fast. She'd have stopped him if he'd been fast, that she was sure of. Slow enough that she felt the approach as a series of choices they were both making. He stopped in front of her. Close. She had to tilt her chin up slightly to hold his eyes. "I'm going to make this very difficult for you," she said. "I know. I have 57 days and an ailing father and a signed preliminary agreement. I know all of it. And you still—" "Yes," he said. "Still." She looked at his face, the strong angles, the dark eyes that had been looking at her across rooms for 11 days, with an intensity that had been slowly taking her apart. She thought about 57 days. She thought about being sensible. She kissed him. She kissed him first. She reached up and took his face in both hands, which were smaller than his jaw but held it anyway, and pressed her mouth to his. A second of pure shock on both their parts. Then he kissed her back. It was not gentle. That was not the word for it. It had the quality of 11 days of managed distance releasing all at once. His hands at her waist, pulling her forward with a certainty that left no room for performance, and she went, and the French law volume fell off the table, and neither of them moved to retrieve it. When they broke apart, they were both breathing differently. She kept her hands at his face. He kept his at her waist. "All right," she said, unsteadily. "Yes," he said. Also unsteadily, which she found deeply reassuring. She pressed her forehead against his, felt his exhale, warm at her lips. Outside the library, the house party continued. Footsteps, a distant laugh, the clock in the hall beginning to chime. "I need to go," she said. His hands tightened briefly at her waist. "Let go." She retrieved the law book. Her hands were not entirely steady. She walked to the door, unbolted it, and stopped with her hand on the frame. She looked back at him. That was the look. She felt it leaving her face. Felt it, knew it was visible, couldn't retrieve it. The look Bertram had described, the one she kept for things that mattered. He stood in the library with his composure in pieces, and his hair slightly disordered, and the expression of a man who has just had the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. She walked out. She made it to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands over her mouth and felt the smile behind them. Enormous, undignified, utterly disastrous. And let it exist for exactly 30 seconds. Then she took her hands away, picked up her notebook, opened to the page of calculations. 57 days. The numbers hadn't changed. But she stared at them for a long time, and for the first time in 3 years, they looked less like a verdict and more like a problem she might solve. The morning after the library kiss, he did not sleep. He had expected this. Sleep and the sensation of Vivienne Marchal's hands on his face and her mouth on his were fundamentally incompatible, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He lay in the dark of his Pemford guest room and conducted a very thorough inventory. The inventory was not of his feelings. He knew his feelings. They had become extremely legible to him over the past 11 days, but of the situation. The situation, which contained 1 engaged woman, 1 signed preliminary agreement, 1 ailing father, 1 39-day deadline, and 1 kiss in a library that had rearranged several things he'd spent 8 years carefully arranging. He thought about the book on the floor, the French law volume she'd been holding, and then hadn't been holding because her hands had been busy elsewhere. He thought about the sound she'd made, the quiet, involuntary quality of it, the sound of a person surprised by themselves. He thought about her face afterward, the look she'd given him from the doorway. That was the look. That was what Bertram's £50, £20, 20, he was going to correct this version of events for the rest of his natural life, had been aimed at and missed entirely, because no amount of money could have been the point of that look, and anyone who had seen it would have understood immediately that it was not a prize or a victory. It was a door. He stared at the ceiling of his Pemford guest room and felt the full, terrifying enormity of the door opening and decided, at 4 a.m, that he was going to walk through it. Not with his usual careful management, not with a plan. Through it, The way you went through things that mattered, with both hands empty and no exits planned. He thought about his father. He thought about 39 days. He got up and wrote 4 letters, including one to a solicitor in London with specific instructions about a preliminary agreement, and went back to bed as dawn came through the curtains and thought, I am not going to be careful about this. That decision, made at 5 in the January morning in a cold room at Pempford Hall, was the most alive he had felt in 8 years. Chapter 10. The problem with a first kiss, the specific, structural problem, is that it establishes what is available. Vivienne had known this in theory. She had not previously understood it in her bones. The understanding arrived over the following 4 days as a kind of permanent distraction, a background sensation she could not switch off, that made dinner conversations slightly disjointed and her sleep consistently worse, and her awareness of Callum Ashby in any given room so acute it was embarrassing. They were careful. The house party was a closed system with sharp eyes and better memory, and whatever this was, she refused to name it. Naming it would make it a thing with consequences she wasn't ready for. It would not survive public dissection. So they were careful. Day 12. The music room. Everyone had gone to dress for dinner except Vivienne, who had stayed to finish a conversation with Miss Aldworth, and Callum, who had had no reason she could see to stay. When Miss Aldworth left, they were alone with the pianoforte between them. "You've been avoiding the seat next to me at dinner," he said. "The seating is Lady Pempford's arrangement." "Vivienne!" She looked at the pianoforte. "If I sit next to you at dinner, I spend the entire meal attempting to have a normal conversation while you say things into the side of my ear that make it very difficult to appear normal." "I say ordinary things at dinner?" "You say ordinary things in a voice you specifically use when we're not in a group." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You notice my voice?" "I notice everything about you," she said, before she could stop it. Then, because it was already out, "which is deeply inconvenient." He came around the pianoforte. She let him. That was information too. She was not retreating, which was its own kind of decision. He stopped close. Not as close as the library, but close enough that she could see the specific quality of his attention. That focused, illuminated look she had stopped pretending she didn't feel. "Inconvenient," he said, with the ghost of something pleased in it. "Don't be satisfied." "I'm not satisfied. It's a comfort, that it's not one-directional." She looked at his jaw, the sharp line of it, the mouth that had kissed her in a library 4 days ago, in a way she had replayed 17 times at a conservative estimate. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and you are not going to make it large." "All right." "I went through the preliminary theft agreement last night, the full terms." She paused. "There are clauses I missed initially, about management rights for the Marshall properties, about my personal correspondence." She kept her voice level. "Your Runnymede observation was correct. The structure matches." He said nothing. She saw his jaw tighten. "I'm not asking you to fix it," she said quickly. "I told you. I know what you told me." He was very controlled. She could feel the control, the deliberate management of what he wanted to do against what she'd asked. "I know. I'm telling you because—" She stopped. "Because I needed to tell someone who would understand why it matters. Because you're the only person in this house who knows the difference between a property clause and a conversation. Because I am so alone in this, and you said I wasn't a variable, and I haven't stopped thinking about it. Because," she said, "you were right, and I thought you should know." He looked at her. Then, very slowly, he reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. Deliberate, careful, not going anywhere he hadn't been before. She stood very still. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I don't know yet." She looked at his hand at the edge of her face. "I want more time." "I'll give you time." "You don't have anything to give. Theft isn't your problem. You are not Teft's property yet," he said, with a quiet that had an edge under it. "And when you decide what you want to do, I want you to know that I will." He stopped, rearranged. "Whatever you need, whatever form that takes, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at his face. All of it, this time. Not the drawing room version, not the composed Duke, but the version underneath that had arrived at the Vance terrace and refused to leave. She kissed him again. Briefly. Nothing like the library, just the press of her mouth to his corner, her hand briefly at his chest. His hand came up and covered hers where it rested there and held it for 3 seconds. Then she stepped back and went to dress for dinner. Day 14, the garden at dusk. She had not planned it. She had simply been in the garden at the right moment when he'd come down the lower terrace steps, and they'd looked at each other in the cold December evening, and without a word, they'd walked together to the far wall, where the winter bare rose arbor gave enough cover for a conversation no one needed to hear. "Bertram told me," she said, before anything else, "about the bet." He stiffened slightly. "What did he say?" "Exactly what you said. Word for word, essentially." She looked at the bare rose canes. "He seemed to think I'd be angrier than I am." "Are you angry?" She thought about it genuinely. "I'm annoyed that it began that way, but She pressed her lips together. "You told me yourself, before he did, and the telling mattered more than the bet." He exhaled. One long breath, the release of something held. "That," he said, "is more than I deserved." "Probably." She turned to look at him. In the December dusk, he had the winter-light quality she'd first seen in the gallery, less polished, more real. "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "If there were no theft, no 57 days, no obligations, what would you do?" He looked at her steadily. "Exactly this, except without any of the careful distance." Her pulse moved. "You'd be careless?" "I'd stop managing it," he said. "I would—" He reached out and took her hand and brought it up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles and watched her over it. "I would be considerably less restrained than I've been." She felt that in the soles of her feet. "The restraint is noted," she said, slightly breathlessly. "Good." He didn't release her hand. "I want you to know what it costs me." "It costs me too," she said. He kissed her. Then, properly, in the rose arbor in the December dusk, with his hands at her face and her hands in his lapels, and this one had a different quality from the library, slower and more complete, the kind of kiss that goes nowhere in particular and therefore goes everywhere. She made a sound against his mouth that she immediately attempted to suppress. He heard it. "Don't," he said, against her lips. "Don't manage it." She kissed him harder and stopped managing it, and the cold evening air was irrelevant, and the bare roses were irrelevant, and the 57 days were somewhere else entirely for the length of it. When they stopped, they stood with their foreheads together in the December dark. "We have to go back in," she said. "Yes." Neither of them moved. "Callum?" She felt him respond to his name, small, involuntary. I haven't decided anything yet. I know, but She exhaled. I'm not going to stop being afraid of this. I want you to know that. The fear doesn't go away. I know, he said. The same is true for me. She drew back and looked at him. You're afraid. I've been afraid since the terrace at the Vance ball. He said it plainly. I am afraid right now, standing in Lady Pempford's rose arbour, that you are, something I cannot put back if it goes wrong. The vulnerability of it, the sheer unexpectedness of it from a man who moved through the world like weather, landed directly in the place she'd been most carefully protecting. Then we're both afraid, she said. Yes. Good, she said, surprising herself. It should cost something, or it means nothing. She walked back to the house. He followed 2 minutes later, which was correct and careful, and neither of them cared even slightly about the care anymore. The billiards room. There was the evening of the 4th day at Pemford, when Bertram organised billiards, and Vivian walked past the open door and made the mistake of pausing. She had never played billiards. Women didn't play billiards. The room was warm and smelled of good wood and brandy, and somewhere inside it, Callum was playing a shot she could hear but not see. The clean crack of ball on ball, and she stood in the doorway for approximately 3 seconds before he turned. Come in, he said. She looked into the room. Bertram and 2 others at one table, Callum at the second, and a chair near the window with no particular occupation. I don't play, she said. I know. He set down his cue and came to the door, which was, she was immediately suspicious of this, blocking her exit without technically blocking it. I'll teach you. I said I don't play. You mean you've never been allowed to play? He said. Different statement. She looked at him. He was waiting with the patient, deliberate expression he used when he had identified something she hadn't admitted yet. She stepped into the room. He showed her the grip first, standing behind her, his hands over hers on the cue, and she was absolutely focused on the angle of the shot, and not at all on the warmth of him along her back, or the way his voice went quiet and specific when he said left hand further. There. She was entirely concentrated on the shot. She missed. The ball careened sideways. Good, he said. I completely missed. You learned where not to aim, he said. Try again. She tried again. She hit it. Not cleanly, not with any particular direction, but genuinely struck the target ball. There, he said from her ear. She stood up and looked at the table and felt the grin before she caught it. He caught it too. She felt him see it in her shoulders. Don't be pleased, she said. I'm not pleased, he said. I'm teaching. You're extremely pleased. The shot went 6 inches to the left of where it should, he said serenely. There is nothing to be pleased about. You're pleased that I missed by only 6 inches instead of 2 feet. That is a significant improvement. She turned to look at him. He was standing very close, still holding his own cue, with the expression she had by now come to identify as the trying not to smile one. You're insufferable, she said. You keep saying that, he said. It keeps being true. He looked at her for a moment. Then he held out the cue. Again? She took it. She tried again. She hit it. Cleaner, more deliberate. And it went 4 inches left. Better, he said. She handed back the cue. Her fingers brushed his in the transfer, and she felt it. that specific, infuriating awareness that lived in her chest now, permanent and unmanageable. And she looked at his hand, and then at his face, and found him looking at her. "Thank you for the lesson," she said. "You're a quick study," he said. "I'm always a quick study." She stepped back. "Good evening, Your Grace." She left the billiards room, and Bertram called after her something cheerful, and she ignored him and walked back toward the drawing room with the billiards lesson and his hands and the 4-inch improvement and the terrible, encroaching certainty of a woman who has started being honest about what she wants. She pressed her hand briefly to her sternum as she walked. 4 inches, she thought, from where it should go. That was, she acknowledged, a metaphor she was not going to examine. Chapter 11. The house party's final week arrived with the quiet intimacy of a closing. Vivienne had 12 days left of it, and she spent them in a kind of careful, conscious joy she had not previously allowed herself. She argued with Callum at dinner, properly argued about politics and estate law, and a poem he'd read aloud in the drawing room that she thought was technically accomplished and spiritually empty. He'd been offended. She'd been delighted by his being offended. He'd come back at her so brilliantly that she'd laughed before she caught it, and across the room, Bertram Crail had made a face she chose not to examine. She let herself sit beside him. She let herself look at him across rooms and not redirect. She let herself feel the warmth that gathered in her chest when he appeared in a doorway, or said her name, or gave her that specific fragment of a smile that he seemed to reserve exclusively for moments when she'd surprised him. This was not wisdom. She was aware it was not wisdom. She had 43 days and a signed agreement and a father who'd had 2 worse weeks and a mother who had written a letter asking, with the gentle terror that underpinned all of her mother's correspondence, whether the theft matter was progressing. Wisdom would have been to stop here, to put back the distance, finish the house party, return to London, and proceed with the column balancing and the necessary. She had apparently stopped being a wisdom person somewhere around day 11 in the Pemford Library. The night it almost happened, day 17. The guests had gone to bed earlier than usual, cold snap, early shooting the next morning. The house was quiet by 11. Vivienne came downstairs at past because she couldn't sleep and the library called and found it already lit. He was there. Of course he was there. She was beginning to think the library was less a room than a private country they'd somehow agreed to share. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them said anything about the lateness or the fact that they were alone or what that meant. She sat in the chair across from his and tucked her feet up and said, "Tell me something about before." "Before?" "Before your mother died. Before you decided not to feel things." She held his gaze. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone." He was quiet for a long time. "My mother used to read to me," he said. "Not when I was a child. I mean when I was 15, 16. Old enough that other people would have found it odd. She'd come to my room before bed and read aloud from whatever she was reading. Novels, mostly. She had extremely dramatic taste." His voice was careful, but not closed. "She did voices. Terrible ones. The villains all sounded like they'd swallowed something." Vivienne smiled. "Gideon slept through everything," Callum said. "He could sleep through anything, always. But I'd lie there listening to her make these terrible villain voices, and I'd think—" He stopped. "I'd think, this is what it is to have someone who would do something ridiculous for you just because you liked it." The fire shifted. The library was warm. "After she died," he said, "I understood that particular thought differently. She had done everything for him, my father, because she loved him that much." He looked at the fire. And I had been watching it my whole life and thinking it was ordinary, that of course you did that for someone you loved. And then she was gone, and I understood that it had cost her. All of it had cost her. And I... He stopped. You decided the cost was too high, Vivian said softly. I decided the risk was too high. He looked at her. There's a difference. Cost implies you know the outcome. Risk means you might lose. And you'd already watched someone lose. Yes. She sat with him in the firelit library for a moment. I'll tell you something too, she said. Something I haven't told anyone. She looked at the fire. I want to go back to France. Not to live, to study. There's a woman in Paris, Duchesse Moreau, who runs an informal school. Not officially, women aren't allowed officially, but she takes students and teaches them law and finance and land management. My mother's family knew her. A pause. I've been corresponding with her for a year. She has a place for me if I can get there. She looked at her hands. It is the thing I have wanted most these past years, more than almost anything. But the Teft engagement is the opposite direction. She said it flatly. Devonshire is not Paris. Teft's management rights clause is not Duchesse Moreau's school. He looked at her with the expression she thought of as the stripped one. Nothing between them and whatever he was actually feeling. Come here, he said. She looked at him. Across the library, the fire between them. She uncurled from the chair. She crossed to him. He shifted, and she sat beside him in the large armchair. Too small for two people, close out of necessity that became choice. And he put his arm around her, and she rested against him, and they looked at the fire. She felt his heart under her cheek, steady, a little faster than it should have been. I'm going to find a way, he said quietly. You said not without your knowledge and consent, he said, which I am now asking for. He looked down at her. Let me look for a way, not to fix it. I understand you're not a problem to be fixed. To find options you don't currently have. She lifted her head and looked at him. This close, in the firelight, she could see every detail. The particular dark of his eyes, the line of his mouth, the jaw that she had put her hands on and kissed and thought about approximately every hour since. Callum, she said. Yes. If you find a way and it doesn't work, then we'll find another. And if none of them work, he held her eyes. Then I will have spent whatever time is available making sure you know what you're worth. And I will. His voice changed quality, went lower. I will manage the afterward the best I can. She looked at his face for a long moment. Then she kissed him. This was not like the library or the garden. Those had been kisses with a destination, a point where she'd pulled back and put the distance back in. This was the kiss of someone who had temporarily stopped calculating distance. She turned into him, and he turned into her, and the armchair was too small, and the fire was warm, and his hands found her waist and her hair, and she felt the quality of his wanting in the specificity of every touch, deliberate, concentrated, the opposite of casual. She made a sound she didn't plan. He answered it in kind and kissed her throat, and she felt her fingers tighten in his hair, and the firelight moved on the ceiling, and the house was quiet around them. The clock in the hall began to strike midnight, 12 strokes, each one more insistent than the last. She became aware by degrees of where she was, of his mouth at the curve of her shoulder, of her hands, of the fire and the late hour and the library and the 12 chimes. She pressed her forehead to his temple. Breathed. "Midnight," she said. He didn't respond immediately. She felt the slight resistance in him, the same as the garden, the management of himself against what he wanted. Then his hands stilled at her back. "Yes," he said. She sat up. He let her. They were both dishevelled and aware of it, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "We should go to bed," she said. "Yes," he said again, with a quality she felt in her sternum. She stood, smoothed her dress. Her hair was partially undone, and she repaired what she could by feel. He watched her with an expression she was going to think about for a very long time. "Vivienne?" He stood too. He looked at her steadily. "I need you to know. What just happened is not the bet. This has never been the bet." "I know," she said. And she did know. She knew it the way you know the things you've stopped arguing with. She walked to the door. "Tomorrow?" he said. She stopped, turned. In the library doorway with the dark house behind her and the firelight still on his face. 43 days, she said quietly. He held her gaze. "Then we have 43 days. She went to bed and did not sleep for a long time, and the quality of the not sleeping was very different from all the previous not sleepings. Chapter 12. The disaster arrived in the form of a woman scorned, a drawing room full of witnesses, and a sentence that should never have been said aloud. It was the 18th day. Vivian was in the back sitting room with Bertram and 2 others, and Callum was somewhere in the East Wing, and Lady Opaline Vance came to find her. Opaline had been civil throughout the house party, more than civil even, with the careful politeness of a woman who had assessed the situation and chosen strategy over sentiment. But something had shifted overnight. Her smile when she came into the back sitting room had a brittle quality that Vivian noticed immediately and filed under. Warning. "Miss Marchall." Opaline sat, accepted tea, smiled at the others. Then, at a lull in the conversation, "I understand congratulations may soon be in order, regarding your engagement." "Nothing is final," Vivian said. "No, I meant—" Opaline paused with delicate precision. "I meant regarding the Duke of Renwick." The room went very still. Vivian kept her face neutral through an act of will. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Only that Renwick appears—" Opaline set down her cup. "Considerably occupied with you. Bertram mentioned something at dinner last week that I found rather charming. A wager, wasn't it? £50, I believe." 20, Bertram said sharply. "And it was—" "That he would make you fall in love with him." Opaline's voice was perfectly pleasant. "By Christmas, which is very soon." She looked at Vivienne with the warm, poisonous sympathy of someone delivering a gift wrapped in silk. "I imagine he's mentioned it," Bertram said. "That is not—" "I imagine," Opaline continued, "that a man of Renwick's particular talents has been very attentive. He's extraordinary at attention when he wants something." She glanced at the door. "I speak from some experience." The room held its breath. Vivian sat very still. The £50. The falling in love. By Christmas. She heard Callum's voice in the library. "I want you to know, it is not the bet." She heard Bertram right now, saying that is not. She heard Opaline, "When he wants something." She stood up. "Excuse me," she said, with the composure she had been building for 10 years. "I need some air." She walked out of the back sitting room and down the corridor and out the east door into the cold December afternoon. and she stood on the terrace with the wind off the grounds, pulling at her hair, and she pressed her hands to her mouth and breathed. The £50, the falling in love, by Christmas. He had told her about the £20 bet. He had told her before Bertram did. He had been, she had thought, entirely honest. But Opaline had said £50. Bertram had corrected it, had started to, and she had not stayed to hear the correction. The £50. Was it possible that Bertram had told her £20 and there was a second, larger bet, one he hadn't disclosed? Was it possible that the whole thing, the library, the garden, the rose arbour, the midnight armchair, was it possible that she had made an extraordinary fool of herself? She pressed harder against her mouth. She did not cry. She had not cried since she was 17, and she was not going to start now. She stared at the winter grounds and felt the cold going through her thin afternoon dress and the wind taking her hair down, and she conducted an accounting. Evidence for the £50 bet. Opaline said it. Opaline who has reason to hurt him, and by extension her. Opaline who has been watching with the patience of someone waiting for exactly this. Evidence against. Callum told her about the £20 bet himself. Bertram had corrected Opaline immediately. The quality of every conversation, every moment in the library and the garden. She had watched him. She knew how to read people. And what she had seen was not performance. But she had been wrong about people before. And she was not. She was not objective about this man. Which was the problem. She had stopped being objective somewhere in the billiards corridor, and now she was standing in the wind in her afternoon dress because a woman had said £50 and her chest had simply closed. The door opened behind her. She was lying, Callum said. She turned. He was there, coat still in hand, clearly having come directly, and his face was doing something she'd never seen before. Not the composure, not the control. Something raw. The £20 bet was everything Bertram offered, he said. There is no £50. There is no falling in love by Christmas. Bertram will tell you. Bertram, who has just spent 10 minutes telling every person in that room what the actual truth is. He paused. Opaline knew about the £20 bet from Bertram, and she made it larger, and she aimed it at you. That is what happened. Vivian looked at him. Her chest ached in a way she didn't want to examine. How do I know that? She said. You don't. His voice was flat and honest. Not with certainty. You know what I've told you and what Bertram told you. And Opaline said something different. And there's no way for me to give you proof of the thing that didn't happen. He held her eyes. What I can tell you is that if this had been a £50 bet to make you fall in love with me, the moment it worked, I'd have won and had no reason to stay. And I am... His jaw was tight. I am nowhere near done staying. She looked at him in the winter afternoon, the cold between them, his coat still in his hand, the rawness of his face. She hates you, Vivian said. Yes, with reason. She wanted to hurt you through me. Yes. He waited. She pressed her lips together. If you're lying to me, I'm not. If you ever lie to me, I won't. He took a step toward her. Vivienne, I have been lying to everyone, including myself, for 8 years. I have been composure and management, and nothing that anyone could get close enough to damage. And then you sat in my window seat and told me to find another chair. His voice went quieter. I would rather you destroy me with accurate information than protect me from lies. She looked at him. She crossed to him and took his coat from his hand and put it around her own shoulders because she was cold and it was available, and she was not ready to fold into his arms. Not yet. Not in the afternoon cold with the house 20 yards away. But the coat smelled like him, and she needed that specific anchor. He stood very still and let her. "I believe you," she said. "I want you to know I'm choosing to believe you. Not that the doubt has gone. It's still there." "All right. I will tell you if that changes." "All right," he said again. "And if Opaline Vance says one more word to me, I'll handle it." "I will handle it," she said. "I'm not a territory to be defended. I'm a person making a choice." He looked at her in his too large coat in the December afternoon. Something moved in his face, something that lived in the specific territory between devastated and grateful. "I know," he said. She stood in his coat for another moment, her hands in the pockets, looking at the winter grounds. 39 days, she said. "Yes." "You said you'd look for a way." "I've already started." She looked at him. "Then look faster." She turned and walked back into the house. He stood alone on the terrace in the December cold and felt the coat go with her, and felt something else go too. Something he'd been holding in the locked drawer of himself since he was 22. He let it go. He let himself feel it fully, in the cold, without armor. It was enormous, and it did not, as he'd always feared, feel like ruin. Chapter 13. She returned to London on a Wednesday, and 3 things happened in rapid succession. First, Callum wrote to her. Not a polite social note. A real letter. 2 pages, with a specific finding he'd made about the theft preliminary agreement. There was a clause on page 6 that contradicted a clause on page 14 in a way that, under current property law, constituted a material ambiguity. If theft enforced page 6, Vivian's personal properties, her mother's French holdings specifically, fell under joint management. If he enforced page 14, they didn't. The ambiguity made the agreement, in a technical sense, challengeable. He had written it in the form of legal analysis. No emotion, no performance, just the information, laid out. She read it 3 times. Then she wrote back, "How did you find this?" His reply, "I've had 3 solicitors reading that agreement for 2 weeks." She sat with that. 3 solicitors. 2 weeks. Before she'd given him permission to look. Before she'd said yes to anything. She did not write back immediately. She sat at her desk and looked at what it meant. That he had been moving in her direction since before she'd acknowledged they were moving toward each other. And she felt the warmth of it and the danger of it, and both of those things were exactly as large as each other. Second, Sir Roland Teft called. He sat in the Marchal drawing room with the patient, proprietary manner he always brought, and he talked about his Derbyshire estate and the new roof he'd had done, and the children's progress with their lessons, and she sat across from him and looked at him. Really looked, perhaps for the first time without the obligation lens in front of it. He was not a cruel man. She didn't think he was a deliberately cruel man. He was a man who had organized 2 marriages with efficiency and managed both women into a comfortable, managed distance. And he would do the same with her. And it would be done with the best of intentions and the absolute minimum of what she needed to be herself. He left at 4 o'clock. She sat in the drawing room alone after the door closed and thought, "I cannot do it." She had thought this before, in abstract, during the worst moments at Pemford. But this was specific. She could not sit across a breakfast table from Roland Teft for the next 30 years and pretend that was a life. She could not. The column was important. The money was necessary. Her father was ill, and she could not do it. Third, Her father called her into the study. He was in his chair by the fire, which was where he spent most of his days now, and when she came in, he said, without preamble, "Rennick has been to see me?" She stopped. "When?" "Tuesday. You were out with your mother." He looked at her with the bright, assessing eyes that illness hadn't dimmed. He had a proposal. Not the matrimonial kind. Or not only. He's made an arrangement with my solicitors. A loan, effectively, except that it's structured as a business investment in the French properties through your mother's family. Legal, clean, and, your mother's solicitor confirms it, entirely detachable from any personal arrangement between the two of you. She sat down. "He wanted me to know," her father said, "that he did not come here as a substitute for your consent. He was explicit that the arrangement stands regardless of your decision about him. He said—" Her father paused. A slight thing happened to his face. "He said that your freedom to choose shouldn't depend on your family's financial situation." He said those words precisely. The fire crackled. "Papa," she said. "I told him I'd done nothing without your approval first," her father said. "I told him to go home, and that I would speak to you." He looked at her steadily. "You're in love with him." She didn't deny it. She had stopped having the energy for denial sometime around day 14 at Pemford. "He may be in love with me," she said carefully. "Is there a difference?" "He's—" She pressed her hands together. "He's not a simple man, Papa. His history is complicated, and his armor is very thick, and I don't know that I can depend on—" "Can he depend on you?" her father said. She stopped. "You're asking whether he's reliable," her father said. "I'm asking whether you are, because a man who structures a business loan to give you freedom of choice before anything else is decided, that's not a man who's careless with the people he loves." He paused. "That looks rather like someone who's terrified of losing you and is trying to do it correctly." She sat in her father's study and looked at the fire and felt the last of the careful, managed distance she'd been maintaining simply dissolve. "He is," she said, terrified. "He told me so." "Good," her father said, in exactly the same tone she'd used on the Pemford terrace when Callum had said he was afraid. "The ones who aren't terrified aren't paying attention." She wrote to Callum that evening. The letter said, "You went to my father." His reply came in 2 hours. "Yes." She wrote, "You arranged the loan before I said anything." His reply, "I wanted you to have options regardless of what you decided." She wrote, "What if I had decided on theft?" His reply took longer this time. When it came, it said, "Then I would have made sure the loan was completely clean of any attachment to me, and I would have spent a considerable amount of time being very unhappy about it in private." She read that 3 times. She wrote, "Come tomorrow, 10 o'clock." She put down her pen. In 29 days, if she'd done nothing, she would have been formally engaged to Roland Teft. The column was now shifted. Not solved, but shifted. And the shift had not come with conditions. The shift had come with choose freely. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. She was terrified, and she was thrillingly, dangerously, unstoppably certain all at once. And the two things together felt nothing like ruin. They felt exactly like starting. Chapter 14. He came at 10 o'clock. He came exactly at 10 o'clock, which she suspected was the result of significant effort, because she had the impression he'd been awake since 6 and had spent the intervening hours engaged in something requiring very deliberate self-management. She met him in the front drawing room. Her mother was upstairs. The housemaid brought tea and was dismissed. They sat across from each other with the tea untouched between them, and she looked at him. At the face she had memorized by now, the lines of it, the specific quality of his attention when it was directed entirely at her, and said, "You should have told me before you went to my father." "Yes," he said, without flinching. "You promised not to act without my consent." "I promised not to act without your knowledge and consent. I acted without your consent. I did. I wanted—" He stopped, reorganized. "I wanted to do something that left you free, and I moved too fast, and I should have asked you first, and I am sorry for the specific form of it, not the intention." She looked at him steadily. "What was the intention?" "To give you a door," he said, "not to push you through it. I'm aware those things feel similar from the receiving end, and they're not the same thing." She pressed her lips together. "My father was moved." "Your father is a good man." "He told me you said that my freedom shouldn't depend on my family's financial situation." She held his eyes. "You said those exact words." "Yes. Why?" He looked at her with the open, stripped expression. "Because it's true, and because I cannot offer you certainty. I can't promise you that I won't get this wrong in ways I don't expect. I can't promise that 8 years of not feeling things hasn't damaged me in ways that will become apparent at inconvenient moments." His voice was very level. "What I can give you is the room to leave, if you need to. And I wanted that room to exist before anything else." The fire between them was very warm. "Callum," she said. "Yes." "I am going to tell Teft no." He held very still. "Not because of you," she said. "I need to be clear about that. Because of me. Because I've been letting financial necessity make my choices, and I am—" She exhaled. "I am so tired of it. And you haven't fixed the financial problem. You've only moved it, and the rest of it I'll have to work out, but I—" She looked at her hands. "I can't sit across a breakfast table from him for 30 years. I found that out on Tuesday." "What happened Tuesday?" "He came to call." She looked up. "He was perfectly pleasant. And I thought about 30 years of perfectly pleasant, and I—" She shook her head. Callum said nothing. He was watching her with an attention that contained everything he was not yet saying. "I'm not saying yes to you," she said. "I need you to hear that. I'm saying no to him. And that's a different decision. One I'm making for myself." "All right," he said, careful, waiting. "What I am saying to you," she said, "is that I would like more time. Without the deadline. Without the columns." She looked at him directly. "I want to know who you are without the urgency of it. I want to argue with you about things that aren't life or death for 3 weeks and see what's left." "And if something's left?" She looked at him for a moment. "Then we'll discuss what to do about it." He exhaled, one long, controlled breath. His hands, which had been very still on his knees, relaxed by a fraction. 3 weeks, he said, at minimum. "And in the meantime—" "In the meantime," she said, "you could have a cup of tea and tell me what you actually thought of Lord Pemford's drainage scheme, because you were very polite about it, and I could see you disagreeing." Something occurred in his face. A warmth, slow and real, and nothing like the practiced kind. "I thought it was an expensive solution to a problem that had a simpler fix," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I thought so too." She poured the tea. He took the cup. Outside the Markle house, London went on, indifferent and continuous, and inside the drawing room, 2 people drank tea and argued about drainage, and neither of them said the large, true thing that was in the room with them, because they had agreed, without saying so, to let it sit and grow. It was already growing. That evening, Roland Teft received a letter. She wrote it herself. 3 careful paragraphs, honest, without being cruel. She thanked him for his patience and his regard, and she told him the truth, that she was unable to proceed, that the fault was not in him, but in her own inability to be what the arrangement required. She sealed it and sent it before she could change her mind. Then she sat at her desk and opened her correspondence from the Duchesse Moreau in Paris, and read it again, and wrote back to confirm that she was still interested, and that she anticipated being able to arrange travel in the spring. She put her pen down. 29 days had become not a deadline, but a cleared horizon. She pressed her hand flat against the desk and felt the specific, terrifying, necessary largeness of a choice made freely. Then she picked up her pen and started a letter to her mother's solicitors about the French property documentation, and to Callum's solicitor about the loan structure, and to the agricultural contact Callum had given her about a paid consulting position, and she worked until midnight with the focused energy of a woman who has decided and is moving. She went to bed and slept, for the first time in months, through the entire night. Chapter 15. The 3 weeks were, Vivian discovered, both easier and harder than she'd expected. Easier because without the deadline, the panic disappeared, and without the panic, she could simply exist in the same rooms as Callum Ashby and discover, at the slower pace of ordinary life, who he was. Harder because who he was turned out to be considerably more than she'd already found, which she hadn't thought possible. She found he was funny. Not the glittering, controlled wit he deployed in drawing rooms, but the dry, specific humour of someone who found the world absurd and had given up pretending he didn't. He made a comment on the 3rd day about Lord Pemford's drainage scheme that was so precisely skewering, she had to press her knuckles to her mouth to keep from laughing in Lady Pemford's presence. She had not forgiven him for that. She found he read widely and remembered everything, and had the specific quality of intelligent conversation she'd been missing since her last good argument with her father. The kind where you say a thing and the other person doesn't simply agree or comply, but pushes it, adds to it, returns it, improved. She found he was patient with Gideon. His younger brother had arrived in London with 2 gambling debts and the sheepish expression of a man who knows he's about to be read the Riot Act. And Callum had read the Riot Act with calm firmness, and then spent an hour with Gideon working out a plan. And she had watched this from the drawing-room doorway and felt something private and enormous move through her chest. She found he looked at her differently when she wasn't watching. She caught it twice, the 3rd day and the 9th, when she'd turned unexpectedly and found him looking at her not with the controlled attention he usually deployed, but with something that had no management in it whatsoever. Raw and certain, and so specific, it was almost difficult to breathe. She did not tell him she'd caught it. She kept it in the private ledger she was keeping that was not about debts at all. On the 10th day, she told him about Paris. They were walking, in the park, properly supervised by a maid at sufficient distance, and she said simply, "I've written to the Duchesse. She has a place for me in the spring." He went quiet for a moment. "How long?" 6 months, initially. "Paris," he said. "Yes." He walked beside her. "That's what you want." "That has always been what I want." She looked at him. "Does it change things?" He was quiet for longer than she liked. Then, "I'm looking at the possibility of business interests in France. There's a wool trade connection that requires someone on the ground for a portion of the year." He paused. "I was going to mention it regardless of what you said just now." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "The wool trade," she said. "I have a French connection through a cousin. It's legitimate." She studied him. "Did you investigate French business interests because of me?" He held her eyes. "I investigated French business interests because I am interested in them, and also because Paris is where you're going in the spring, and I intend to be wherever you are, and I thought a reason was less alarming than the truth." She stared at him. "Was I wrong?" he said. She pressed her lips together. She felt the smile fighting behind them, the enormous, disastrous one. She held it. "I would have preferred the truth. The truth is that you're going to Paris in spring, and I intend to follow you there, and I thought perhaps wool trade was less terrifying to hear." "It is considerably more terrifying," she said. "The wool trade sounds like a pretext." "It's both a pretext and a legitimate business interest." "Callum." "Yes." "You're going to follow me to Paris." "In the most appropriate and non-threatening manner possible." "Yes." She turned back to the path and walked on, and he fell into step beside her, and she allowed herself, for one private moment she wouldn't report, to feel the full size of it. He was going to follow her to Paris, not because she needed rescuing, not to manage her or arrange her, because she was going to be there, and he wanted to be where she was. She kept walking. The park was cold and winter grey and exactly right. On the 16th day, he kissed her in the corridor of the Harrington Music Hall. They had been standing in a dimly lit passage between the music room and the card room, not planning, simply arriving at the same time. And she had said something cutting about the soprano, and he had laughed, really laughed, no management, and then looked at her with the eyes that had no management either, and kissed her against the wall, with his hands framing her face, and her hands in his lapels, and the muffled sound of a Scarlatti sonata on the other side of the door. It was different from all the previous kisses. Not more or less urgent, different in quality. The quality of two people who have stopped wondering whether they're doing the right thing and are simply doing it, with the whole weight of themselves behind it. When it ended, they stood with foreheads together in the dim corridor. "The 3 weeks," she said. "Yes?" His voice was careful. "I've been thinking about what comes after them." He went very still. "I haven't decided anything," she said. "I want you to know that. But I have been—" She exhaled. "I have been thinking about it, which is its own kind of decision." He said nothing. He was the best she'd ever seen at the silence that was listening. "I'm afraid of needing you," she said. "That's the core of it. I've arranged my whole life around not needing anyone. And you—" She pressed her forehead harder against his. "You are very difficult not to need." "I know the feeling precisely," he said. "Does it help you, knowing the feeling?" "It helps me understand that what I feel is not weakness," he said. "It has taken me some time to understand that. But yes." She looked at him in the dark corridor. "You are better at this than I expected," she said. "At what?" "Loving something." She felt him react to the word, not pull back, but receive it with the total stillness of someone who has been given something they'd stopped expecting. "You've been telling me you're bad at it. You're not." "I'm learning," he said. "Specifically, I'm learning from a very demanding teacher." She laughed. That was the one, the real, unguarded, full one. She felt him feel it. "There it is," he said softly. "There what is?" He pressed his mouth briefly to her hair, just once. "Everything Bertram wanted £50 for." She drew back and looked at him, and then she kissed him once more, brief and decisive, and they returned to the musicale from different directions, and no one could prove anything. Chapter 16. On the 21st day, he got it wrong. He got it wrong in the specific, foreseeable way of a man who has been managing other people's affairs for 8 years and occasionally forgets that the person in front of him is not his staff. He had spoken to the Duchesse Moreau, not to interfere. She gave him credit for that in the aftermath, when she was calmer. He had written to introduce himself as someone connected to Vivienne Marchal, and to ask whether there was anything the Duchess needed, any administrative matter, any correspondence, anything at all, that might facilitate Vivienne's arrival. The Duchess had replied. Vivienne had found the letter because it had arrived at the Marshall house addressed to him in care of her, because apparently the Duchess had no other address and had sent it to the logical destination. And she had opened it before she realized it wasn't for her. She had read 4 lines. 4 lines were enough. He came when she wrote, which was immediately. She met him in the front hall, not the drawing room, the front hall, which was where you met people when the drawing room warmth was not on offer. And she held out the letter and said, with a quiet that was worse than shouting, "Explain this." He read it. She watched his jaw move. "I was going to tell you." "When? After you'd arranged everything?" It was an introductory letter. To my contact, my Duchess, my arrangement that I made, independently without your assistance. Her voice was very controlled. "I know you meant well. I need you to hear that it doesn't matter." He looked at her. "You're right. You went around me. Again." "Yes." He didn't qualify it. It was wrong. It was... She pressed her lips together. "I have spent my entire life being managed by people who meant well. My father with the Teft agreement. My mother with her anxious helpfulness. Teft himself." She met his eyes. "I chose you specifically, in part, because I thought you understood that I am not a situation to be handled." "You're not," he said. "And I handled you, and I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't..." "I know it doesn't fix it." He was very still. "I don't have an excuse. I had an instinct to smooth your path, and I acted on it without asking. And the instinct, however well-intentioned, was not mine to act on." He paused. "I'm learning. I told you I was learning. I got this wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. "This will happen again." "Probably," he said, with the honesty she had originally found maddening and now found necessary. "I've been managing things for 8 years. It's not a habit that disappears in 3 weeks. Then every time it happens, I will tell you. I want you to. I'm not going to be gentle about it." "I know." Something in his expression. "I wouldn't want you to be." She stood in the front hall and looked at him. At the tight jaw, the open, undefended eyes, the man who had admitted fault without qualification and was waiting, without performance, to see if she would stay. "Next time," she said, "ask me first?" "Yes." "Always ask me first?" "Yes." A pause. "Vivienne, I need to tell you something." She waited. He looked at her with the naked, unprotected face. No armor, none of the 8 years of careful management. "I love you," he said. "That is not a graceful declaration. I am aware the timing is terrible, but I have been sitting on it for 2 weeks, and I find I cannot..." He stopped. "I find I cannot continue without you knowing." The front hall was very quiet. "You love me," she said. "Yes." Flat, certain, without embellishment. Entirely. In the specific way I spent 8 years deciding not to love anything. She looked at him. She crossed the hall. She took his face in her hands, both of them, the way she had in the Pemford library, the very first time, and looked at him up close, the dark eyes and the strong angles and the jaw that gave nothing away except right now, when it was giving everything. "You are," she said, "the most impossible, presumptuous, well-intentioned, badly behaved, genuinely excellent man I have ever encountered." "Yes," he said, into her hands. She kissed him. In the front hall, without a library or a garden or a corridor as cover, in the full daylight coming through the front windows, she kissed him with the full weight of what she had been not saying for 3 weeks. He kissed her back with no restraint at all. When they stopped, she was slightly breathless. So was he, which she found deeply satisfying. "I love you too," she said. "Since somewhere around day 11 in the Pemford library, when you sat down in my chair and started reading French property law. I was reading the drainage survey. You had both out. I was multitasking." Something moved across his face, warm and helpless and completely unlike a duke. "Say it again." "I love you," she said. "Now stop looking at me like that, or my mother will come down and we'll have a situation." He pressed his mouth to her forehead. "We already have a situation." "A worse situation," she said. He laughed against her hair, and she closed her eyes and kept it. Chapter 17. He asked her on a Sunday, not formally, not in the middle of a drawing room with witnesses and the full performance of a Regency proposal. He asked her in her father's study, which they had both been using as a library, surrounded by her father's books and her own correspondence, and the drainage papers she'd been reviewing for a Suffolk estate consultation. She was on the floor, which is where she did her best thinking, surrounded by pages, when he came in and looked at her and said, "I want to marry you." She looked up from the floor. "That's not a question," she said. "No." He came and sat on the floor beside her, which was not a thing dukes generally did, and looked at the papers. "I'm working up to the question." "All right." "I want to marry you," he said again. "I want to go to Paris in the spring and come back and marry you. Or marry you first and then go to Paris. Or marry you in Paris. I haven't decided the order." He looked at her. "I know you want Paris and the Duchess and the 6 months and the work that doesn't depend on anyone's permission. I want you to have all of that. I want to be the person you come back to." She set down the page she'd been holding. "I'm difficult," she said. "You are the most difficult person I know. It is one of your best qualities. I will always have opinions about property law and drainage. I am aware. I will sometimes be unreasonable. I will sometimes be overbearing." He held her eyes. "We'll be very bad for each other's tendency to be right about things." She looked at him on the floor of her father's study, at the entirely un-Duke-like quality of him, sitting surrounded by her papers, asking her something enormous in the most ordinary way. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes. Yes," she said again. "To all of it. Paris first, then married, then Paris again if we need it." He put his hand against her face and kissed her with the quality she now understood was specifically his. Deliberate and total, no part of himself withheld. She kissed him back the same way. Her father appeared in the doorway at that moment, assessed the situation on the floor, and retreated with the tact of a man who had been waiting for this for some time. Chapter 18. The engagement was announced on a Thursday, and London had, as it always did, considerable feelings about it. The general response ranged from delighted scandal to scandalized delight. The Duke of Renwick, who had spent a decade being widely admired and politely feared, was marrying a half-French, twice overlooked, emphatically opinionated woman who had argued with Lord Pempford about drainage at a dinner party and been correct. The gossip columns were very busy. Opaline Vance sent a polite note of congratulation that Vivienne read once and declined to answer, which was its own reply. Bertram Crail arrived in person on the Friday morning and shook Callum's hand, and then looked at Vivienne and said, "For the record, it was £20, not 50, and I never believed you'd fail." "What did you believe?" Vivienne said. "That he'd fail to notice you were already halfway there." He grinned, unrepentant. "I was right about that too." Vivienne looked at Callum. He looked back with the expression that had stopped requiring translation. "He was not wrong," she told Callum. "I know," he said, with the dignity of a man accepting an accurate assessment. The weeks of the engagement had a different warmth from the weeks before. More settled, more certain, the quality of people who have stopped being afraid of what they're building and have simply started building it. He called every day. This was perhaps more than strict propriety required, and rather less than either of them would have preferred, given that what they would have preferred was considerably less proper. They argued about everything: estate management and French law, and Gideon's choices and the wool trade connection, and whether or not the fourth Lady Pempford's portrait was in fact a Gainsborough. And the arguments were the best part, the ones where she pushed and he pushed back, and they arrived somewhere neither of them had started, and both of them knew it was the thing that would sustain them for 30 years. He touched her with the specific quality she had come to recognize as his particular restraint, deliberate and held back and expensive. The control of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and was managing himself against it with considerable effort. A hand at her back, fingers at her jaw, his mouth at her temple. She was, she acknowledged privately, making the restraint harder. She had stopped being careful about what showed in her face around him, and what showed was the wanting, and she knew he saw it. She was not sorry about it. On the 8th day of the engagement, in the Marshall Library at 10 in the evening, when her parents had retired and the housemaid had gone to bed, and the house was quiet, and she absolutely had not engineered this, he kissed her, and she kissed him back. And this time, there was no midnight clock, no footsteps, no carriage. She pulled him closer by the lapels, and he came, and the library was warm, and his hands moved from her waist to her back and held her with the focused certainty she'd been feeling for weeks in every doorway, touch, and corridor moment. "Vivienne," he said against her mouth, low and careful, warning himself as much as telling her anything. "I know," she said, and she pulled him back in. This had a different quality from everything before. Not urgency, not desperation, but the deliberate thoroughness of two people who have stopped having reasons to stop. His hands in her hair, the backs of her knees against the library desk, his mouth at her throat, her jaw, the curve of her shoulder where the dress didn't cover. She made a sound she didn't suppress. He lifted his head, looked at her. The library was warm and quiet, and his hair was disordered, and his expression was the stripped open one, no armour at all. "We should stop," he said. "Should we?" she said. His hands tightened at her waist. "We should," he said. "Stop or not stop. And I need you to choose because I am not..." I am not capable of being sensible about this on my own." She looked at him, at the face she had memorized, at the dark eyes with no distance in them. "We're getting married," she said. "In 3 weeks, yes. 3 weeks is a very long time." "Vivienne?" "I am," she said, choosing. He looked at her for one suspended moment. Then he kissed her in a way that contained nothing held back. She kissed him exactly the same way. Later, the fire burned low, and the library was very quiet. She lay with her head on his chest and his arm around her, and the sound of London outside the dark windows. She felt the warmth of him and the specific, settled weight of being exactly where she'd chosen to be. 3 weeks, he said, into her hair. Yes. I'm going to count every day. She smiled against his chest. I'll count them faster. He pressed his mouth to her hair. She felt him smile. Vivienne Ashby, he said softly, trying it out. Vivienne Marchal Ashby, she corrected. I'm keeping Marchal. Obviously, he said. She pressed her hand flat over his heartbeat, felt it, steady and present and entirely real. Callum, she said. Yes. You know that look, the one Bertram wanted £50 for. Yes. It's yours, she said. It's been yours since the window seat. His arm tightened around her. She closed her eyes and listened to his heart. Chapter 19. 3 weeks. She would not describe them as easy. Nothing about Callum Ashby had ever been easy. What they were was vivid, the quality of a life that had stopped being managed and started being lived. He sent her books, not flowers. He had understood very early that she found flowers a passive-aggressive form of compliment. But books, with notes on the pages, arguments he wanted to have later, things he'd read and thought of her and needed her to have. She sent back the books with her own arguments in the margins. His replies were detailed and incorrect, and she told him so. He came to argue about it in person, which was always the plan. They went to the Agricultural Society twice. She had been given a permanent reader's membership, arranged by Callum with her explicit permission and prior discussion, which she had given because it was hers to give, and she wanted it. She wrote her first published paper, on clay sublayer drainage, the Addison coefficient, and the corrected methodology. Callum's name appeared in the acknowledgements. She had put it there herself. She told her mother about Paris. Her mother was magnificent about it. She said in French that a woman who knew who she was and what she wanted was the most beautiful thing. And then she said it again in English, so the housekeeper could hear it too. She told Callum about the paper. He read it the day she gave it to him. He came back the next morning with 11 specific comments, 2 of which were corrections she accepted, and 9 of which were wrong, and she told him so, and he told her she was wrong about the 9, and they argued about it for 45 minutes, and she loved every second. You are, she said, at the end of the 45 minutes, the only person in England who argues with me and gets better as he goes. You argue back harder when I'm almost right, he said. I've noticed. You're almost right once. You're wrong 8 times. We'll let the journal decide. The journal will agree with me. The journal, he said, is staffed by men who've been wrong about Addison for 30 years and will not be eager to be corrected. Then they'll learn, she said. He looked at her with the look. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Just you. She kept that in the private ledger. The week before the wedding, Gideon arrived. He was 20 and sheepish and had clearly spent the journey rehearsing an apology for the gambling debts that came out tangled and too long. She listened to all of it, and then said, "You're forgiven. Now tell me what you actually want to do with yourself." He blinked. "I'm sorry." "Not the apology. The forward. What do you want?" He looked at her, then at Callum, then back at her. "I've been thinking about the law," he said. "Property law, specifically." "Good," she said. "I'll give you a reading list." Gideon went away with a reading list and an expression she recognized as the one Callum had worn in the Pemford window alcove, the look of someone who has just been seen instead of managed. "He's going to be fine," she told Callum. "I know," he said. He needed someone who asks what he wants before telling him what to do. She looked at him. "Do I do that?" "Always," he said. "It's one of the things I love most about you." She looked at the reading list she'd written out, at the paper she'd published, at the letter from the Duchess, 2 pages of warm welcome and specific instructions. She thought about the Vivian of 3 seasons ago, standing at the edges of ballrooms, counting people who didn't look at her. She thought about the Vivian who had walked out onto the Vance terrace and found a man looking at the dark and being startlingly honest about it. She thought, this is what a life looks like when you stop settling for sufficient. It looked like arguments about drainage, like books with notes in the margins, like a man on the floor of her father's study, saying, "I haven't decided the order in the most un-Duke-like way imaginable." It looked like choosing. Chapter 20. The morning of the wedding. Cold, January bright, the kind of morning that apologizes for winter by being extremely clear. Vivienne dressed in cream silk. Precise, beautiful, entirely breathable, not a frill on it. With her mother's pearl earrings and her own hands steady at the fastening. Her mother did her hair with hands that were not entirely steady, and her father sat in the chair by the door with the bright eyes and the cane and the expression of a man who has arrived at something he was afraid he wouldn't reach. She kissed his cheek before she left. He said, "You look like yourself." She thought, that is the only compliment that has ever fully landed. The church was St. George's. Not because of tradition, because the light at noon through the high windows was extraordinary, and she had gone specifically to check, and she had been right. She walked in on her father's arm and found Callum at the altar. He was watching her walk toward him with the expression she had spent 4 months learning to read. Not the Duke expression. The Callum expression. Unmanaged and certain and very slightly overwhelmed. She walked 22 steps. She counted them automatically because she counted everything. He looked at the 22 steps and the composure she was maintaining and the way she was walking toward him with the full weight of her choice behind it, and his jaw did the thing. She reached him. He took her hand. His was warm and completely steady. "You counted," he said softly, under the rector's opening words. "I always count." "How many?" 22, she said. His hand tightened on hers. "I've been counting since October," he said. "Days, specifically." "How many?" "Enough," he said. "Enough to know." The ceremony was as they had discussed. The words that were true, nothing extraneous. She said them with her full attention. He said them back with his. When he put the ring on her finger, his eyes didn't leave hers, and she felt the full weight of his particular quality of attention, the kind that had been undoing her since the Vance terrace, and let it. Gideon, in the front row, was very moved. Bertram Crail, beside him, was eating an almond biscuit he had somehow smuggled into the church, and when Vivienne's eyes moved briefly to him, He gave her an extremely dignified nod. She almost laughed in church. Callum felt it, and his mouth moved, just slightly. "Don't," she said. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "You're smiling." "It's our wedding," he said. "I'm allowed." When it was done, and they walked out into the January bright, he put his mouth close to her ear and said, "You kept the laugh." "I nearly didn't." "It was Bertram with the biscuit, wasn't it?" "It was absolutely Bertram with the biscuit." They got into the carriage, and he kissed her before it moved, which was perhaps more than weddings technically permitted, and she kissed him back with the same logic. That evening, the rooms at Rennick House had a fire that someone had built generously, and the specific warmth of a winter evening made deliberately comfortable. She stood at the tall windows and looked at the dark London garden and listened to the house settle around her. He came to stand behind her, not touching, just the warmth of him, present and patient. She turned. He was looking at her the way he had been looking at her since October, across rooms and corridors and ballrooms and a Pemford window seat. The look she had told him was his, the one she kept for things that mattered. "Vivienne Marshall Ashby," he said. "Callum," she said. "I love you." "I know," she said. "I have it dated and filed." Something broke open in his face, warm and helpless, and nothing like a duke. He crossed to her and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her for a moment. Really looked, with no part of himself anywhere else, and she looked back the same way. "You're doing it," she said softly. "What?" "Being present." She touched the line of his jaw, her fingers light. "No part of you somewhere else?" "No," he said. "No part of me anywhere else." He kissed her, and she put her arms around him, and the fire was warm behind them, and London was dark outside. And this was nothing like settling, and nothing like managing, and nothing like the columns she'd been balancing for 3 years. This was the door she'd been afraid to open. She pulled him closer. He said her name like a prayer, low and specific, against her temple. She felt his hands, warm and certain, at her waist, her back, her hair. She felt herself stop managing the distance between what she wanted and what she'd allow herself to have. She felt the specific, enormous, terrifying freedom of someone who has finally stopped keeping the most important thing at arm's length. She answered him, and he answered her, and the fire burned, and the night was long, and the warmth between them was not recklessness and not ruin, but something truer than either. The warmth of two people who have chosen, fully and without remainder, each other. Later, the fire very low, the room its darkest, most private self. She lay with her head on his chest and listened to his breathing, slow and settled, and traced the line of his collarbone with one finger, and felt the extraordinary ordinary pleasure of exactly where she was. "I'm counting," she said. "What?" "The days we have left before Paris." She smiled against his chest. "I've been counting backward for 3 months. First the deadline, then the 3 weeks. Now forward." She felt him feel the difference in the word. Counting towards something. His arm tightened around her. "How many?" he said. 60 days until we sail." She pressed her hand over his heart. 60. "And after Paris?" "After Paris," she said. "I stopped counting for a while." He pressed his mouth to her hair. She felt him smile. "That," he said, "is a sufficient plan." She closed her eyes and listened to his heart and let herself have it. All of it, The warmth and the weight and the man and the morning that would come, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. And for the first time in 4 years, she fell asleep without counting anything at all. Epilogue. Paris, 60 days later. The Duchesse Moreau's study smelled of old leather and new arguments, which was precisely the right smell for a room where things were learned. Vivienne sat at the long table with 5 other women, and one very interesting professor borrowed from the Sorbonne. Illegally, technically, but the Duchesse had long since stopped being concerned about what the Sorbonne's faculty did with their Tuesday afternoons, and argued about the inheritance laws of the Napoleonic Code, which were wrong in 17 specific ways she had identified during the crossing. The professor, who was 60 and Basque, and had been argued into agreement by a woman exactly once before in his life, was in the process of being argued into it a second time. "The provision on page 84, Vivienne said, contradicts the provision on page 112 in a way that... The provisions are consistent, Madame la Duchesse." "I'm not the Duchess. I'm the student, and the provisions are not consistent. If you read them against the 1808 amendment, the 1808 amendment was drafted specifically to resolve an ambiguity that your reading reintroduces." She pushed the volume across the table. "Page 84. Read it against the amendment." The professor read. The Duchesse Moreau, at the head of the table, was carefully not smiling. Outside the study window, the courtyard of the tall Parisian house was grey and winter-bright. A man was sitting on the low wall at the courtyard's edge with a book, in the way of someone who has found a good wall and is using it, with the complete ease of someone who intends to still be there when the afternoon is done. He looked up when the window opened. Vivienne leaned out. "You're going to freeze." "I'm reading," he said. "You've been on that wall for 2 hours." "The wool trade correspondence," he said, "takes time." "There is an excellent fire in the front salon." "The courtyard has better light." She looked at him on the wall in January in Paris, with his coat collar turned up, and his breath in the cold air, and the book balanced on his knee, and felt the look leave her face, the full one, the one she kept for things that mattered, and let it go. He caught it. He always caught it. Across the courtyard, in the winter light, he looked back at her with exactly the same thing in his face. "Professor Belacqua has conceded page 84, she called down. "Has he conceded page 112? "Not yet. You'll get there," he said. She pulled the window shut. She turned back to the table where the professor was still reading carefully now, with the expression of a man finding something he hadn't expected. And the Duchess was passing around the 1808 amendment, and the other 5 women were leaning in with the specific, concentrated energy of people who have been given a room where their minds are the most important thing about them. Vivienne sat down. She thought about Bertram Crail's look, the one he wanted £50 for, the one Callum had said, "Everything." She thought, some things can't be bet on, some things can't be anticipated, some things arrive in a window seat you didn't know you were leaving open, and they sit down, and they don't leave, and you stop asking them to. "Now," said the professor, with the weighted, slightly shaken quality of a man who has just been correctly contradicted, "let us discuss the 1808 amendment." Vivienne picked up her pen. 60 days from the wedding. She wasn't counting anymore. The end. Romance Haven, original audiobook. If this story captured your heart, let me know in the comments which moment was your favorite. The tension, the romance, the scandal, or the Duke himself. And if you'd love more immersive Regency romance audiobooks filled with forbidden love, powerful dukes, and unforgettable chemistry, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you for spending time here at Romance Haven, where your escape into romance awaits. Until next time, happy listening.